Hello everyone, you're listening to The Crime Room, a true crime podcast about how homicide detectives catch bad guys.
Because the road from innocent to guilty is never a straightforward line. The reality is that some bad people are really good at telling lies, and that some good people are really bad at telling the truth.
I'm Julian Grace, a murder mystery novelist and your co-host.
And I'm Brandon, a law enforcement supervisor with over 10 years of police experience.
Let's talk crime.
Let's talk crime.
Welcome back to the second episode of Interrogating Maggie Murdaugh. We have a lot of ground to cover, so let's dive in. Maggie Murdaugh is in trouble, in hot water with the South Carolina highest law enforcement authority, SLED, over the suspicious murders of his wife, Maggie, and younger son, Paul. The two of them were discovered shot multiple times on the family estate Moselle. The person who found them, you know him very well by now, Maggie Murdaugh. The legal scion of the Murdaugh law practice, well-respected and very connected man.
That's right. SLED conducted 2 more interviews, a second and a third interview/interrogation with Alec. On this episode of The Crime Room, we'll examine their interrogation techniques and talk about Alex's answers and much more.
Make sure to listen to part 1 of Interrogating Maggie Murdaugh series. You can find the Crime Room podcast on any podcast platform you like to use or directly from our website, thecrimeroom.com. And if you like us, of course, like, subscribe, and leave us a comment introducing yourself. So, Alec meets with SLED again for a second interview, or as police officers call it, a follow-up, which is a code word in TV shows that you're on the cop shortlist for being a suspect. How close am I to assume SLED is suspecting Alec at this point of murdering his family? But the evidence maybe are not there to back them up to make an arrest.
So I think that Alec was always a suspect. Right from the start, he is a family member and they tend to commit these crimes, unfortunately. And the story that he was giving them, what he was saying really wasn't adding up. It wasn't making sense. A lot of vague answers and vague descriptions of what he did that day. So yeah, I think he was probably their number 1 suspect at this time. When they were on scene, Alec didn't have any blood on him. Maggie and Paul didn't have any transportation to get down there. It just didn't make any sense. So yes, they suspected him. But they didn't want to rush into anything and lose evidence. So this is about the second interrogation was about 3 days later. So they're still in the midst. It still is a recent crime, a recent murder. And it's very typical for these investigations to take more than a couple days or weeks before they proceed with arresting the suspect.
And the first 48 hours of any investigation, especially a homicide, are critical.
Yeah, so in 48 hours, there's a lot of evidence that is really becoming uncovered. And it's the most important because within those 48 hours, the suspect has either an opportunity to erase some evidence or travel or escape. So within those 48 hours, you really have to move fast and find this evidence to proceed with either arresting or uncovering evidence.
I don't think the general public understand how small and narrow 48 hours is because, especially in Maggie Murdaugh's case, the crime scene is huge.
Right.
1,700 acres. That's a lot of land to cover. Not only that, but on the night of the murder, the crime scene presented another huge challenge that we discussed in episode 1, which was the weather.
Right, the footprints and tire tracks were erased.
So in the first 48 hours, the cops already have 2 very significant issues that are faced with: the size of the property,
right,
and the weather on the night of the murder.
I think in this case, since it was outdoors, most of it, the weather was a prime factor. They could handle the size of the property, but I think the weather was probably one of the bigger issues that they had. And that being said, the 1,700 acres is pretty impossible to search thoroughly, and within the 48 hours, you probably won't get even close to half of it. So you have to focus on which areas you need to attack first and process first. And we actually have a post on our website about search patterns and explaining when to use them and how to use them. And we actually have a post on what the investigators in this particular incident with Alec Murdaugh would have done when they arrived on scene and how they would have handled this particular search.
You can go to our website and subscribe to our newsletter to access the premium content with monthly helpful law enforcement information, and the search patterns will be in that packet as well. So we're looking at several days later. The case is very active, very ongoing, and as we've listened to the 911 tapes Alec made that night, he is incredibly upset from finding the bodies of his family members. Questioning him that night at that point is hard given his state of mind and emotions.
Right, it's going to be tough either way. It's really hard to pinpoint a suspect to be your go-to suspect at that point because each individual acts different, especially during something as traumatic as this. So several days later, as you mentioned, it was 3 days later, and the case is still very active. They're still talking to witnesses, those who spoken with Alec that night, trying to understand Alec's alibi, understand what he did that day, spoke to his brother about his whereabouts. In the first interview with Alec, the night of the murder, it actually left detectives with many questions.
It left me with many questions.
Yeah, after listening to that interview, it was very vague. His answers weren't really complete, and he left a lot of room for interpretation.
And it wasn't the question the police officers were asking. I think there were valid questions. I think there were questions that anybody who is investigating, really, it's crucial information that they needed him to provide, but he was giving them nothing.
Right. A lot of nothing. A lot of, like I said, discrepancies in times in which that if he had to, he can alter his alibi at a later time.
You refer to vague times and vague answers. Isn't that what he wanted to accomplish?
Most likely. Many criminals, in fact probably all criminals, don't like when you question their timeline because it's hard to keep a timeline straight. If you ever watch that show, The Judge, in the show his son hits a pedestrian, kills him, runs home and doesn't tell anybody initially, eventually tells his father. But what his father does, who is a judge, the next day he enacts what he would have done the day before, so that when he tells the police, he pretends that the next day was the day it happened, and he has a timeline. He even talks to a couple homeless people, he talks to a bunch of other people, does everything he would have done the day before, so that he would be able to tell detectives, yeah, I did this, 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 and this, because he actually did, and he would have the timelines.
He's creating the memories.
Right, exactly,
in his
the memories.
mind. So he sounds more convincing and believable when in fact he isn't believable. I should say not believable, but he is not truthful and honest.
Right. So some things they would have done in the meantime between the first interrogation / interview, because it was more of an interview, to the 3 days later, is they would have processed the scene to the fullest. Unfortunately, we can't hold, or law enforcement can't hold the scene forever. So they will process it to the best of their ability, because eventually they are going to have to release that property back to Alec, who I would assume was their main suspect at the time. So they needed to make sure that they had everything documented, everything found, because Alec could have gone there later and destroyed it or moved it.
So just to clarify, the law officers can hold the scene for more than 24 hours. There's no limit. I mean, technically you can hold the scene until you solve the crime.
Well, you'd have to...
Or what is accepted in the industry, just general?
Well, there is no accepted general. It's just as long as it takes to process a scene, but if it's going to be a prolonged period of time, you're going to need a judge's approval. So if you need to process a scene for 2 months, which is an extremely long time, you're going to have to get approval from a judge to approve you holding that scene, because that's someone's property. That's somebody's Fourth Amendment right. So you wouldn't be able just to hold the scene forever. They would have submitted evidence in this meantime, although it wouldn't have came back yet. They need to start it immediately because it takes weeks and months to come back, and especially if the suspect is arrested early and they move for a speedy trial, it may not come back in time. They would have spoken with many of the witnesses that Alec claimed to have interacted with. So the people he called, his family member, his mother's healthcare worker, Blanca the maid, those involved in the boat accident as well. They would probably go to almost every single one of them and attempt to get an alibi for them.
Because it was Alec who brought in the boat accident on numerous occasions in that interview when he spoke to them.
Right, and
He was the one who really pointed detectives to, oh, well, my son was in a boat accident. If somebody had a grudge, it all started after the boat accident.
and to be fair, that's legitimate. That is an actual motive. There was a large civil suit, ongoing civil suit, but that could potentially be a motive for one of those individuals or parents of those individuals to take action. So he was attempting to elude police into thinking that was the main cause. But every time they asked about a threat or who made a threat, he never had an answer. It was just some person Paul knew, he just heard about it or something. Something without legitimate claim to. And then lastly, there are so many moving parts, so many investigators. I know you have one head detective, but there are so many different moving parts that... So each person will write a incident report, and they will pretty much compile all the incident reports together so that everybody is caught up to date. So that if you're the head detective and you briefly spoke to somebody and they forgot to mention something, another investigator, it will be in the report. You'll be like, oh yeah, okay, all right, so we have this evidence so that he can now speak to Alec about.
They've probably found video surveillance and tried to reconstruct his movements in the car as well.
Yeah, so they would probably drive down. This is a common tactic that officers and law enforcement will use. They will drive down the road in which a suspect stated that they traveled, and they will just visually look at houses and stores to determine whether they had video surveillances pointing out. Because if they did, they will look to see, all right, did he travel this road? If you see the car, great, they can follow him. If not, why was that car not shown, or why couldn't they find him?
So this is what the officers did the first 48 hours after the first 911 call that was made by Alec. Now they're meeting Alec for a second interview, second sit down, hopefully to clarify things. He's probably calmer now. Reality has hit, his wife and son are killed. As an active police officer and the expert on the show, what will be some of the things you would want Alec to be able to answer at this second interview? I mean, potentially this could be very crucial for detectives. I'm sure they went in expecting a lot, or at least hope to get a lot from him. Are you looking for clarification, or do you have a more of a form agenda when you sit down with him?
Well, I would have believed that he, we've been mentioning, he's a main suspect. So it's more of a formed agenda. But what they would have liked is, after speaking to Alec, especially 3 days later, where he would have had time to compose himself, he would have spoken to his brothers, maybe somebody else involved, the healthcare worker, and really honed in on the timeline. So when speaking with him, you would pretty much want a clear timeline. Hey, what did you do? Oh yeah, I looked into things. I remember I talked to people. At this time I was doing this. At this time I was in the field with Paul for approximately 30 to 45 minutes. Not the answer that he gives, which is more than 20 minutes but less than 2 hours, which is the most absurd thing ever, because you're going to know if something's going to be close to 20 minutes or if it's closer to 2 hours.
Especially if you're a lawyer, I feel like they're the type of person who are always like checking the time because they have to go to meetings and court and talk to clients. I feel like when you're a lawyer, you're a very time conscientious person.
Well, you're doing a lot of work outside of work. So you're in the office for so many hours, and you go home and you have so much time, and it's not atypical for a lawyer to go back home and work more, especially after dinner. They may have a big case the next day. They may have a big case in which Alex stated he has a big case. His son's Paul's huge civil suit, in which Alec is now involved with, because he provided alcohol or allegedly provided alcohol to Paul, which makes him a liability, which makes his property and his money at stake.
So the officers are again with Alec, and the first thing that jumps at me is that Sled and Alec are back in a car. It's not something that I had seen a lot from other law enforcement. And what jumps at me again is we're in South Carolina in the middle of June. The heat must be suffocating.
Yeah, and you can't really have the AC on either because it's going to affect the audio. So it was probably windows up, no AC in the middle of June in a hot car. So it was probably uncomfortable for everybody, even besides the interview.
Speaking of turning up the heat on the criminal, they took it literal.
So I believe they probably did this because Alec said he is a lawyer. I don't believe he is that intelligent, but
They wanted to sweat him out.
I actually think he requested it because
He requested a hot sauna.
yeah, because he didn't want the media to catch on that he's being interrogated again. He doesn't want to do it at his house because everybody would be there. He wanted to meet in a secluded location where he felt more comfortable.
Yeah, but he had like brothers around the area, whatnot. I don't know. Seeing him in a car again, I don't know. That was the funny part in a very non-funny situation. So why don't you give us a brief overview of the interrogation slash interview? Before the show, we discussed that Alec and his phone and how the detective handled the phone request, which I think was very eloquent. And listeners and viewers who have seen the interrogation and the tapes that are circulating out there might have missed what the detectives were actually doing with the whole phone thing.
Right. So they allow him to take a phone call. Alec is brief, but that shows that the detectives are willing to work with Alec. You need to take a phone call. All right, we're working together. Soon after he's done, before they ask any questions, they ask for his phone so that they can do a data dump. And the reason they ask it before they start questioning him or giving him information is because they want him to feel as though that they're partners and he's more willing to cooperate initially as opposed to during the investigation in case some hard questions come up or he's not doing so well and he's like, you know what, never mind. They could still seize his phone and apply for a search warrant, but search warrants always have risks in which that something may be written wrong or it may not go the way that they wanted. In court, the search warrant may become invalid and no longer useful. And in this case, his phone and his data is very valuable.
And doesn't it take a really long time for the phone companies to turn over data as well? They've been giving officers nationwide a hard time.
So that was more so Apple a couple years ago. And although you can get most information from these phones with these data dumps, Alec was still concerned because you can get all this information about his client privilege information. So he was asked if there was any information on his phone that may be client privilege, and he said yes, he texts a lot, he doesn't email so much. And it appears to be very important to Alec, and we later know why. It's because of all the fraudulent activity he's been going through and been conducting.
It makes Alec come across very calculative because he mentions the boat accidents at least 3 times, maybe even more. But the point is that he talks about the boat and Paul and calls it an accident and so on. But he doesn't say, oh, by the way, my family and I are on the hook for millions because of the boat accident. And there was a huge lawsuit that the family of the girl, Mallory, that died in an accident filed against the Murdaugh.
Right, and it's somewhere the civil suit was believed to be around $10 million. And just for an understanding of how much money the Murdaughs had, his property just recently sold for $2.5 million. So $10 million is probably all the money that he had, or would have had, absent his drug abuse and other faults.
From his answers, if you listen to the entire tape in that second interview, you can quickly get the impression that it's going to be another nothing burger interview. His answers couldn't have been more vague. Am I wrong? Am I the only one who thinks he could have done a better performance? I mean, he had 3 days to get the story straight, and once again, the detectives are walking away from the second interview with nothing, empty-handed.
I agree. You'd think he would have narrowed his timeline down and figured out something that better fit his story or his timeline. He did have a couple things in which he had to figure out, such as what time he left work, when he saw Blanca, when he saw his mother's healthcare worker. However, he's a lawyer. He should know, hey, I have some set times here, but I can do a little wiggle room here. His story should not have been the way it was, even though it was fake. He should have definitely had a clear story of what happened.
Yeah, it seems a lot was circling around the time frames and the time he was giving, and sometimes it feels like he was getting lost in the time frame that he had given earlier.
So if you actually watch the interviews and interrogations, you can see when looking at him when he's answering questions, he's not answering them from his memories. He's kind of going back and forth trying to remember what else he said. Because if he says he was doing something at one time, then 5 minutes later he's saying he was doing something during that time. Investigators know he's lying automatically. So he's trying to think of his story of what he's made up, not in memories, because it's really easy to do memories. It might take you a few seconds, but you'll be like, all right, I did this, then this, then this, then this. All of his interrogation interviews weren't like that. They couldn't ask him, hey, what did you do throughout the night? It was pretty much just, oh, what you do then? This. Oh, what you do this? Then this. So it wasn't a cohesive story whatsoever. It was pretty much them asking him and him just kind of answering in vague ways.
Trying to copy and paste pretty much. So that's probably very frustrating as a detective, especially since you are investigating a double homicide. I have two very prominent individuals coming from a prominent family. I'm sure what made that interview so stressful is the fact that he cries. I mean, he cried the first time, which is obviously understandable. Nobody takes away from the pain that he might have experienced if he was innocent. And it's hard to watch the second time around. He's crying again. Is crying a tactic to distract used by criminals? What's the best way to move past the emotion and the tears and get the interview back on track as a police officer?
So let's first address the emotional aspect of when a suspect cries. It's actually a huge hurdle for an investigator. Once a suspect cries or goes into a fit of anger, it actually gives them a form of emotional release. So it unfortunately gives them the space and time to build up their composure. And when they're able to do this, they are able to come back to a normal state of mind and start thinking logically or think back to what they were saying and to form their lies. If you don't let them cry or make these fits, you're actually able to get the much needed information from them because they're just this pressure is building up and building up and building up. And eventually they either mess up and tell the truth or they just come up and say, yeah, I did it. I was upset or they hurt me or something happened. And as far as a hurdle for investigators, of course, I do believe suspects do cry intentionally to get away from questions, or the interview may be going in a certain direction. They'll start crying to try to change the topic and have it geared towards something else. And a way to address that is if they have a emotional release, they start crying, you take 2 steps back, you give them a snowball question, let them answer it, but you go right back into what you were talking about. You don't dodge what they're trying to evade because that's what they want. Obviously, if it's a victim or a witness, you will have empathy. You will take a step back. If they don't want to talk about something right now, you give them their space. Maybe they'll say something later when they're able to, but you give them their space. If it's something that you need to ask them, it's very important to the case. You do, but you do it in a manner that respects their person.
We watched the interview together. How do you think the second interview went overall? Do you think the detective should have pushed him, pressed him harder, confronted him, What about you guys? Do you think detectives went easy on Alec during his second interrogation? Let us know in the comments.
Yeah, I would love to hear what you guys thought about that. As far as me personally, I believe they did a very good job. It's still a fresh case. It's 3 days in. They're still waiting on information. They're talking to people. They're gathering information. There's just two questions that really bothered me in which that they didn't go into further. It was when Alec said that he went when he found Paul, his phone fell out of his pocket. He went to his phone thinking that he was going to do something, but then thought no.
Yeah,
They
he touched him to see his pulse, and then he didn't have a pulse. Like his child doesn't have a pulse, and then you go for his phone
before well, that's even before he sees Maggie because
or
he's
goes to Maggie.
yeah he says he sees Paul first, and Maggie's 15 feet away. He doesn't go check on her. He grabs his phone thinking he's going to do something, but no. He
And
has
puts
it.
it back in the pocket.
Yeah, it makes no sense.
Yes.
So that makes no sense. They needed to dive into that much further. What do you mean? What were you going to do with his phone? Because Alec already has his phone on to call 911. There was no need to grab that phone.
No need whatsoever.
And I guarantee that he would not have a good answer. He would have said, "Oh, I don't know. I just wasn't in the right frame of mind."
He was like, I put it back because I didn't want to mess up with the crime scene. I didn't want to touch anything. No, you already touched the phone, and it's weird. And we need to know what you did.
Definitely
No
weird.
one's asking you, and we're ending this interview on a cliffhanger. Thank you very much. That's what's happening.
The second question I had was they kind of mentioned a little bit about him not having blood or dirt, but they never really asked him, "Hey, why don't you have any dirt on your knees? Did you not bend over to see Paul? How did you grab his phone? How did you try to turn him over? Why is there no blood on you? None on your hands, nowhere."
Nowhere. How do you check for pulse? Somebody who's been shot in the head with a shotgun or a rifle. There's blood everywhere. If you turn over and you check for a pulse, you will have dirt because you're out in the country. It's a farm.
Right.
And now he was in his Sunday best. So these are two very good and serious questions that, again, we didn't get an answer, but most importantly, the detectives walked away from that hot car not knowing not knowing or not pressing Alec Murdaugh to answer.
So as somebody who hasn't conducted any interrogations, what did you think about the interview? Was there any questions that you thought they should have asked? Were they too lenient? Were they aggressive? Or what were your thoughts?
Listen, all my experience in interrogating criminals comes from Law and Order, and Olivia Benson does not go very easy on whoever's sitting across from her. So I expected some good cops, some bad cops, some come on, Alec, tell us the truth. You're going to jail. None of that. It was a very lackluster interview, and I was annoyed the whole time when he was heckling and opening the door to spit. I was like, what is he doing? Why is this happening? So to me, it was very discombobulated interview, and I understand they were in a very difficult position, the detectives being them, because he was not a good witness. He was not a good person to interview because none of the answer he was given really made sense, and like we've said, the timeline was very confusing.
Agreed. And so that interview ended. 2 months later, there was a third, and this is the last interview, and this is actually more of an interrogation. And this was 2 months later.
And it wasn't in a car.
It was not in a car.
That should have been his first hint, like the first red flag. This time they're not letting me speak to them in a car. Something's up.
Well, actually, they did have a red flag because the first thing they did when they came in, the lawyer spoke up and said, "Hey, you were supposed to give us
Yes,
information."
he did show up with a lawyer. Maybe he was like, okay, I'm not in a car. Something's going on. But yes, he did show. He shows up with a lawyer friend, And it seems like the lawyer was like more in tune with what the situation, like the lawyer, his lawyer friend, was able to read the room better than Alec Murdaugh. Because the lawyer was like, hold up, you're asking us questions, you want information from us, but you called us, you called Alec, and you told him that you're gonna be giving him information, and that's why we're here. And Alec was like, no, 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 I'm gonna answer.
Yeah, so the lawyer, the attorney, kept questioning the police and the law enforcement officers and saying, "Hey, no, you said you were giving us information. The only reason we're here is because you were going to give us information." But Alec kept saying, "No, it's fine. I'll answer whatever they want. Keep going. No big deal." And this is actually a very important interview slash interrogation because they had more evidence. They had more information.
So as it going to turn out, it's the last nail in Alec Murdaugh's proverbial coffin. Tell us more why this interview, third and final, was so important and what happened.
Right. So just before we go into that, I just want to mention one thing that no matter how much the attorney or lawyer wants to stop an interrogation, they can say no, don't talk. It's ultimately up to Alec. So that was what was happening. Even though the lawyer, the attorney was saying no, stop questioning him, it's up to Alec to keep going. So during this interrogation,
Oh, and he went there.
yeah, you could tell that Alec was going to give the same vague answers, or attempt to at least, but he was not aware that the investigators now had some hard evidence and some facts and truths that they were going to question him with about these uncertainties. So they first start off by just telling Alec, "Hey, we know when you left. There's no vague, maybe 5:30. You left after 6 because we spoke to your brother. He left at 6 and you were still there. So at the very minimum, you left at 6 and you called 911 at 10:06. So those are the two definite timelines. So Alec has no wiggle room there now.
They're helping him. They're like, you weren't able to tell us anything about your timeline. We're gonna help you out here.
Yeah, we have it.
Now they have him nailed.
Right. So they start questioning him on Paul's truck and asks if he's ever been in the truck, whether he drives around with Paul, if there's a firearm ever in the truck. And they confront him and say, "Hey, it was just dropped off at the shop not too long ago, and there was still a firearm in there. Why when we arrived on scene was there no firearm? I believe it was a shotgun that was there." And Alex starts giving vague answers. "Oh, I don't know if it was there or not. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, maybe you took it out." Which was the same type of answers that we expected him to give. But that, they have witnesses saying there should have been a shotgun there. It's not there now. And a shotgun was used in the crime. And then they get into Maggie and when she got home, asking if they met by the shed or if they met at the home. By the shed, I mean the kennels. And Alec didn't know.
Yeah.
How do you not know? This is the last memories of your wife.
Where you've seen your wife, yeah. And it's not a hard question. I mean, they weren't
No,
asking.
it's not.
They weren't asking him was she wearing her, diamond earrings or the pearls.
Right, what color socks was she wearing on the left foot? Did it have a rip in it? Well, no, I don't know that, but you should know.
Mascara or no mascara. I mean, they were asking a very basic question. Even you would know if you met her by the shed or inside the house.
And this isn't like it was 2 months ago where you're asking me, "Hey, did you go to the shed to grab a tool?" You're not going to remember this. This is one of the most traumatic nights, or should be one of the most traumatic nights of your life. You're going to remember a lot of details. Some of them may slip your mind because it was so traumatic that you didn't remember some facts. But this is almost everything he doesn't remember. He remembers vague times. It just doesn't make any sense.
It was all blur.
But so he admits that Maggie wasn't going to sleep at the house that night. She was going to sleep at their vacation home. And that actually shows marital problems, that they weren't getting along together. So much so that Blanca, the housekeeper, advised investigators that Maggie was worried about the silver case, and Alec was the one who called Paul and her home that night to discuss it.
Yeah, insisted that they show up. Not only that, but in interview one and interview two, every time when Maggie was brought up, he said that she was wonderful, the love of his life.
No
They had no quarrels, they had no arguments. I mean, maybe the occasional thing, but it was everything was minor. And all of a sudden, we have a wife who is not coming home. She's sleeping in a whole another home, crying over money, the fact that they don't have money. They have this lawsuit that Alec hasn't said a single word, the cause of which is the boat accident that he's been telling us all about. Yeah, that smells like a motive.
Right, right, absolutely. So these next two pieces of evidence that they presented to Alex are probably the two most important.
They hit him with it.
Yeah, they hit him hard. But this first one they didn't really handle so well, and I think they kind of slipped in the way that they did it. Sometimes it happens, you don't ask the questions the right way. But so they advised Alec, hey, Paul posted a video that night of you and him laughing, having a good time. You were playing with this tree, trying to do something funky with it, and it was posted on his social media. In that post, they said to him, in that post, you were wearing khaki pants and a dress shirt. And they asked him, hey, when did you change? Alex says, what time does the video look like? I don't believe the investigators should have answered it, but they said around dusk, 7:30 or 8, and that's when Alec comes back and says, I guess it was when they got back. So they kind of let him answer that question maybe appropriately. What they should have done, and this is me Monday night quarterback, so I understand I wasn't there. They should have said, hey, there was
You tell me.
well,
You are the one
especially for that, yes.
changing your clothes.
But more so, hey, there was a video posted on social media from you and Paul playing on a tree. Was it that night? Lock him into that answer. If he says yes, okay. When did you were wearing khaki pants and a dress shirt. When did you change?
Don't ask him what he was wearing because he can't remember where he met his wife. I don't even remember what he wore that night.
Right. And later, they kind of get into it a little more. They later asked him, hey, was that from that night? And Alex says he doesn't know. And I mentioned this to you, and I think this is important to discuss. They were laughing and having a grand time in this video. This could have been the last happy moment they've ever had if they took that video that night, and he doesn't remember. It was taken around 8 o'clock. Paul was found dead 2 hours later. And in between that, Alec took a alleged nap, went to see his mother, came back and found them. So that could have, in Alex's timeline, that would have been the last good memory they ever had. And he doesn't know if it was from that night. How do you not know?
The only way you don't know is you know and you don't want to answer.
Right.
Because you're as guilty as sin.
Because you were presented with the fact that your clothing in that video was different from when officers arrived on scene. And when officers arrived on scene, you had no blood or dirt on you. Which means that clothing had all the evidence. So here's another key piece of evidence that they presented to Alec. There were shell casings, obviously by Maggie and Paul, but those same shell casings from the rifle were found by their home.
Inside the home.
Right, I believe right outside the home.
Yeah.
Right, so
On the property.
that shows that it was a weapon, one of their weapons.
Mm-hmm.
Which doesn't match up with anything Alec is saying. He's saying that one shotgun was stolen, and now all of a sudden, there is proof that, and some attorneys and professionals are arguing that the firearm and casings could be junk science, but for right now, what we have is pretty accurate. They're saying,
Gotcha.
these shell casings match those shell casings. Why? And I will give the investigators a lot of credit for that, going back and taking all the casings and ammunition and
Examining it.
examine it, because if you can't tell that the ammunition's the same until it's shot, right? So if you have ammunition that has never been shot, it won't show the same distinct marks. So this indicates that the same shells were shot both at the house and on scene, and they matched it up probably almost perfectly. So that's why it's so compelling. That's why it's so important. Right after that, they let Alec ask a couple questions, which were inconsequential. They weren't really important. And then the detectives ask Alec straight up, did you kill Maggie? Did you kill Paul? And of course he answered no. And I believe, and can probably assume pretty accurately, that the lawyer said right after that, we're done. We're not going to talk anymore. And that's why they shut off the interrogation. And I just want to mention that you can tell in the body language of the investigators how uncomfortable that question is. They even know or have good evidence that Alec is the one who did it. But you can tell before they ask it that they were uncomfortable. They didn't want to, because it's always strange asking that question. But they knew they had to, because this is probably the last interview/interrogation that they were going to have. That they probably had enough evidence, even before the interrogation, to arrest him.
But let him walk in thinking that he will walk out a free man.
Right, because once you arrest him, he's not going to give you any information.
He's not going to talk.
No. He's still... Oh, there was another part I almost forgot to mention. He says, am I a suspect? As if...
No, you're not. We just like to chit-chat with you.
Right.
We like your empty answers so much.
Yeah, we like hotboxing a car so
Tell
much.
us, Alec, where you went to law school.
We wanted you back. Yeah, so that was pretty much the last interrogation. And then next, in our next episode, we're going to be going over the
court case
and the testimonies in the court case and what really showed or proved that he was the one who murdered Paul and Maggie. And in fact,
the cops got the right man.
He says that he lies. We'll go over what the lie was in our next episode. But he says himself he lied about something.
Next week on The Crime Room, Alec Murdaugh is arrested. Now what? We discuss his trial, the revelations, and the scandalous claim made by the defense, and how the controversy surrounding the cops who almost caused a mistrial. Thanks for listening. Till the next time.
Till the next time. Hey, you just listened to another amazing episode of The Crime Room. If you want to listen to more episodes, stop by thecrimeroom.com. And if you really like us and our work, you can become a supporter. For only $3 a month, you will receive access to a bonus podcast episode, a monthly members-only newsletter, and for our most dedicated subscribers, Jolene and I will answer a crime-related question submitted by you. Thanks for your support, true crime fans.